Walking through the grand halls of a medieval castle, you might admire the towering stone walls, the intricate tapestries, or the roaring hearths, but would you ever suspect the floors beneath your feet? What if those very floors could vanish in an instant, dropping you into a hidden pit or a secret dungeon? This wasn't just paranoia, it was deliberate design. Castles, those symbols of power and prestige, were often built with a darker purpose: to betray. Kings and lords didn't just rely on loyalty to keep their thrones secure. They engineered their homes to be labyrinths of deception, where every corridor, every staircase, and even the most ordinary-looking floor could be a trap waiting to spring. Think about that for a moment. These weren't just fortresses meant to keep enemies out. They were carefully crafted to ensnare those already inside: friends, advisors, even family. A misplaced step could mean the difference between standing in a banquet hall and plummeting into darkness. And it wasn't just about physical traps. The very layout of these castles played mind games, creating doubt and fear among those who walked their halls. A door that led nowhere, a hallway that suddenly dead-ended, a chamber with only one exit, all designed to make even the most trusted ally feel vulnerable. Because in the game of kingship, power wasn't just won on the battlefield. It was maintained through whispers, secrets, and the constant threat that the ground beneath you might not be as solid as it seemed. So how did these traps work? Who were they meant for? And what does it tell us about the rulers who ordered them built? Over the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the layers of history to reveal the hidden mechanisms of betrayal woven into the very stones of these castles. You'll discover how kings used architecture as a weapon, turning their homes into instruments of control. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a medieval castle the same way again. Because behind the grandeur and the glory, there was always a trapdoor just waiting to be opened. The need for deception in castle design didn't appear overnight. It grew from the brutal realities of medieval politics, where power was never guaranteed and betrayal lurked in every shadow. Early fortresses were built for brute strength: thick walls, towering keeps, and imposing gates meant to withstand sieges. But as rivalries between nobles intensified and rebellions became commonplace, rulers realized sheer force wasn't enough. They needed an edge, a way to turn their homes into instruments of psychological warfare. Enter the architects and engineers, masters of illusion who transformed these stone giants into labyrinths of treachery. Take, for example, the humble floor. What seemed solid could hide a pitfall lined with spikes, triggered by a hidden lever or a loose stone. Some castles featured entire staircases that led to dead ends, forcing intruders into kill zones where archers waited. Others had doors that opened to sheer drops, a cruel surprise for anyone fleeing in haste. These weren't just defensive measures, they were calculated displays of dominance, reminding everyone inside that the Lord's favor could vanish as quickly as the floor beneath their feet. But perhaps the most chilling innovations were the ones designed for those closest to the throne. Secret passages allowed rulers to eavesdrop on conversations or slip away unnoticed. False walls concealed escape routes, but they also hid listening posts where spies could gather whispers of conspiracy. Even the great halls, where feasts were held and alliances sworn, often had hidden alcoves where armed guards could emerge at a signal. Every architectural choice sent a message: trust no one, not even the walls around you. This shift from brute fortification to cunning deception mirrors the era's political climate. Kings and lords faced threats not just from outside their walls, but from within: ambitious relatives, disgruntled vassals, even their own guards. a castle's design became a reflection of its owner's paranoia, each trapdoor a silent testament to the fragility of loyalty. And as the Middle Ages wore on, these tricks grew ever more elaborate, proving that in the game of power, the most dangerous weapons weren't swords or siege engines, they were the secrets built into the very stones. Imagine sitting at a lavish banquet in a medieval castle, surrounded by flickering torchlight and the murmur of courtly conversation. The wine flows freely, the food is abundant, and your host, a powerful lord, smiles warmly across the table. But beneath your chair, hidden by rich tapestries, lies a trapdoor rigged to open at the pull of a lever. This wasn't just a defensive measure, it was a calculated act of theater, designed to make every guest question their safety. Medieval rulers didn't just build castles to withstand attacks, they crafted them to unsettle the mind, turning stone and wood into tools of psychological domination. The most effective traps were the ones people knew about but couldn't see. A lord might casually mention the fate of a disloyal vassal who disappeared after dinner, leaving the rest of the court to glance nervously at the floor. Some castles featured false doors that opened onto sheer drops, or corridors that looped back on themselves like a maze. These weren't accidents, they were reminders that the ruler controlled not just the castle, but the very sense of reality within it. Uncertainty became a weapon. Was that servant lingering too long by the wall? Could the hallway ahead be a dead end or a death trap? The longer you stayed, the more the architecture itself seemed to whisper, "You are being watched." This psychological warfare extended beyond physical traps. Take the placement of private chambers. A king's bedroom might be accessible only by a single, easily guarded staircase, but hidden passages allowed him to come and go unseen. The message was clear: he could reach you, but you could never reach him. Even the grandest halls where oaths of loyalty were sworn often had concealed galleries overhead perfect for eavesdropping. Every architectural choice reinforced the same lesson. Trust was a luxury, and survival depended on playing by the ruler's rules. What's chilling is how effective these tactics were. You didn't need to drop every rival through a trapdoor. You just needed them to believe you could. A single rumored oubliette could stifle dissent for years, because the fear of betrayal was often stronger than betrayal itself. And that's the real genius of these designs. They turned paranoia into a kind of loyalty. After all, how could you plot against someone when the walls themselves might be listening? This wasn't just medieval cruelty, it was a masterclass in control. By weaving deception into the fabric of their castles, rulers transformed their homes into living, breathing extensions of their power. The stones didn't just protect them, they spoke for them in a language of hidden dangers and unspoken threats. And for those who walked these halls, the greatest trap of all wasn't the pit beneath their feet. It was the creeping realization that nowhere was truly safe. Among the most notorious examples of architectural treachery is Château de Coucy in northern France, where the grand staircase wasn't just for show, it was a death trap. Built in the 13th century, this imposing fortress featured a central staircase designed to collapse under the weight of attackers, sending them tumbling into a stone-lined pit below. But here's the twist: the mechanism could be triggered selectively. A loyal servant might ascend safely, while an unwanted guest could vanish mid-step, their fate sealed by a hidden lever pulled somewhere in the shadows. This wasn't just engineering, it was a brutal lesson in power dynamics, where even the act of climbing stairs became a test of trust. Warwick Castle in England took a different approach with its infamous murder holes. These weren't mere gaps in the ceiling for dropping rocks or boiling oil, though they served that purpose too. Positioned above key passageways, they allowed defenders to listen in on conversations below before deciding whether to intervene. A whispered plot against the Earl might be met with sudden silence as crossbow bolts rained down from above. The genius of these designs lay in their ambiguity. Were those holes just for defense, or were they a reminder that every word spoken within earshot could be your last? Then there were the throne rooms with secrets beneath their splendor. At Kyrenia Castle in Cyprus, archaeologists discovered a concealed pit directly under the dais where the ruler sat. Historical accounts suggest this death pit wasn't just for storage, it was a last resort for disposing of rivals during public audiences. Imagine pledging loyalty to your king, unaware that a single nod from him could send you plunging through a disguised hatch. These weren't just traps, they were theatrical devices, turning governance into a performance where the stakes were life and death. Escape routes added another layer of intrigue. The Tower of London's infamous Bloody Tower included a hidden stairway accessible only from the monarch's private chambers. While rebels stormed the gates, the royal family could slip away through passages known to a select few, a literal metaphor for the privilege of power. Meanwhile, guests might find themselves wandering into dead-end corridors or courtyards with gates that locked from the outside, their confusion turning to dread as realization dawned. What's fascinating is how these features evolved alongside political strategies. As alliances grew more volatile, castle designs became more elaborate in their deceit. The message was clear: survival required more than strength or wealth. It demanded mastery over space itself, the ability to control who moved where, when, and how. These castles weren't just buildings, they were chessboards made of stone, where every architectural detail was a move in a game few could afford to lose. Picture a hole in the ground no wider than a man's shoulders, so deep that the faintest echo of screams would never reach the surface. This was the oubliette, a nightmare given form in stone. The name itself whispers its purpose, derived from the French word for to forget. These weren't just prisons, they were tombs for the living, where a ruler's enemies vanished without ceremony, left to starve in darkness. Unlike dungeons meant to hold prisoners for ransom or trial, oubliettes had one cruel function: to make people disappear as if they'd never existed at all. The psychological terror of these pits can't be overstated. Imagine the moment a trapdoor swung open beneath someone's feet. No warning, no chance to plead. The fall alone could break bones, and at the bottom there was no space to sit or lie down. Victims stood in their own waste, their fingers scraping uselessly at slick walls as hunger gnawed at them. Some pits had spikes at the bottom to ensure no one survived the drop. Others were just deep enough to prolong suffering, their design a meticulous calculation of despair. And the worst part, these horrors were often hidden in plain sight. A rug in the Great Hall, a loose flagstone in the courtyard, what seemed mundane might conceal the entrance to a forgotten hell. But the true power of the oubliette wasn't just in its cruelty, it was in the silence that followed. No public execution to martyr the condemned, no body to bury, no grave to mourn. A person could vanish between breakfast and supper, and by nightfall, their name would be spoken only in whispers, if at all. This erasure was the ultimate display of control. A king didn't just punish rebellion, he rewrote history, ensuring dissidents left no legacy, no rallying cry for others to follow. Archaeologists have uncovered oubliettes in castles across Europe, their walls sometimes still bearing the faint scratches of those who tried to claw their way out. At Château de Loches in France, one pit lies directly beneath the castle's chapel, a grim irony where prayers for mercy would have drifted unheard above a chamber designed to deny it. Other sites reveal bones jumbled in the dirt, their stories reduced to fragments. These pits weren't anomalies, they were policy, a chilling reminder that in the wrong hands, architecture could be as lethal as any sword. What's haunting is how ordinary these tools of terror seemed to those who used them. Dropping a rival into an oubliette required no messy beheadings, no public spectacles. Just a quiet word to the right guard, a nod toward the right floor tile. The efficiency of it all speaks volumes about the medieval mindset. Power wasn't just about who you could kill, but who you could make the world forget. And in castles designed to betray, forgetting was as simple as closing a trapdoor. One wrong step, that's all it took. In castles where false floors lurked beneath rugs or straw, the difference between walking to your chambers and plummeting into a spike-lined pit could be a single creaking floorboard. These weren't just hidden traps, they were psychological masterstrokes. Imagine a hallway that seemed solid but tilted under the weight of anyone not instructed where to step. The moment your foot sank, the floor became a slide, dumping you into a waiting cage or worse, and the real cruelty, these mechanisms were often reversible. A servant could cross safely by sticking to the right path, while an intruder or a disgraced courtier would trigger the trap with their ignorance. The floor itself became a judge, weighing loyalty in the silence of its hinges. Staircases were no safer. Some castles, like the infamous stronghold of Château-Gaillard in Normandy, featured steps that could collapse mid-ascent, turning a retreat into a free-fall. A fleeing enemy might make it halfway down before the entire structure gave way, dropping them into a confined space where archers waited. But even more chilling were the staircases that changed. Hidden counterweights or removable sections allowed defenders to alter routes at will, so a path that led to safety 1 hour might dead end in a murder hole the next. These weren't just defensive measures, they were tools of control. A lord could dictate who moved where, turning his castle into a shifting puzzle where only he held the key. The genius of these designs lay in their duality. By day, a grand staircase might impress visitors with its sweeping curves. By night, it could become a death trap for anyone sneaking where they shouldn't be. Even the act of climbing to a private chamber wasn't just a journey, it was a test. Were you trusted enough to know which steps would hold, or were you one misstep away from discovering the castle's darkest secrets firsthand? And then there were the floors that didn't just tilt, they vanished entirely. In some castles, entire sections of flooring could be withdrawn into the walls, leaving no trace of their existence. A group of attackers bursting into a seemingly empty hall might suddenly find themselves standing on thin air, their momentum carrying them into a pit below. These traps weren't just about killing, they were about spectacle. The suddenness of the drop, the screams echoing from unseen depths, it sent a message to anyone who witnessed it. This is what happens when you cross the line. What's striking is how these mechanisms preyed on basic human instincts. Trusting the ground beneath your feet is second nature, but in these castles, that trust was a liability. Every step required calculation, every doorway demanded hesitation, and that's exactly what the architects intended. By blurring the line between safety and peril, they turned the very act of moving through a castle into a performance of obedience. The real trap wasn't just the spike pit or the collapsing stair. It was the constant, gnawing doubt that nowhere, not even the floor you stood on, could ever truly be trusted. Secret passages weren't just hidden shortcuts, they were psychological weapons disguised as architecture. While grand halls and towering walls projected strength, these shadowy corridors whispered a darker truth. In a medieval castle, even the stones could lie. Take Windsor Castle's infamous dungeon steps, a narrow staircase that could be sealed at a moment's notice, turning what seemed like an escape route into a tomb for pursuing enemies. One moment, rebel soldiers might think they'd cornered the king. The next, they'd find themselves trapped in a lightless tunnel, listening to the distant clang of a portcullis slamming shut behind them. But these tunnels weren't just for defense. They were stages for power plays. The Priory of Sion, shrouded in myth, allegedly used secret corridors to smuggle treasure beneath the noses of rival factions. More historically verifiable are the accounts of lords who used hidden passages to eavesdrop on guests, or worse. At Château de Chinon in France, a concealed spiral staircase connected the king's private chambers directly to the Great Hall. While courtiers debated politics below, the ruler could appear among them without warning, like a specter materializing from the walls. The effect was deliberate. It made his presence feel omniscient, as if the castle itself was an extension of his will. Ambush corridors took this deception further. Some castles featured sally ports, narrow tunnels that allowed defenders to slip outside and flank besiegers. But others turned the concept inward with passages that doubled as kill boxes. A visiting noble might be led down a dimly lit hallway, only for archers to emerge from hidden alcoves, arrows already nocked. The real terror wasn't just the violence, it was the realization that every wall might conceal a threat. Even allies couldn't relax, knowing a friendly conversation in one chamber might be overheard or interrupted by armed men bursting from a tapestry. The duality of these designs speaks volumes about medieval rule. A passage meant for escape could become a death trap with the slide of a bolt. A tunnel built for secrecy might suddenly flood, drowning intruders in icy water. Control wasn't just about having options, it was about denying them to others, and that's what made these hidden corridors so potent. They turned the castle into a living, breathing entity that seemed to conspire with its master. To walk its halls was to navigate a labyrinth where the walls themselves might choose to betray you. Perhaps the most unsettling detail, many of these passages were built to look ordinary until the moment they weren't. A servant's stairwell might suddenly dead-end at a false wall. A wine cellar could conceal a hatch leading straight to the moat. The uncertainty was the point. Because in a world where even the floor beneath your feet might vanish, the greatest power wasn't strength or wealth. It was knowing the secrets the stones kept. And for medieval rulers, that knowledge was the ultimate advantage. Murder holes were the medieval equivalent of a sniper's perch, silent, deadly, and utterly ruthless. These openings in castle ceilings might look like simple architectural quirks to the untrained eye, but their purpose was anything but innocent. Positioned above gateways, stairwells, and narrow corridors, they transformed ordinary passageways into slaughterhouses. The name itself leaves little to the imagination. These weren't defensive features. They were instruments of execution, designed to deliver death with clinical precision. The mechanics were horrifyingly simple. As attackers funneled through a choke point, perhaps a gatehouse or a cramped hallway, defenders above would rain down destruction through these gaps. Boiling oil wasn't just poured, it was aimed, cascading onto helmets and seeping through chainmail, cooking men alive inside their own armor. Archers could pick off targets one by one, their arrows striking downward at an angle that made shields nearly useless. Even rocks took on a new lethality when dropped from height, crushing skulls like eggshells. But perhaps the most chilling detail, murder holes were often invisible until it was too late. From below, they might blend into shadow or be disguised as part of the ceiling's design. By the time invaders noticed the gaps overhead, the first volley was already on its way. What's often overlooked is the psychological warfare these holes enabled. Imagine storming a castle gate, your heart pounding, only to hear the sudden clank of a portcullis slamming shut behind you. Trapped in a stone tunnel, you'd look up and see nothing but darkness. Then the screaming would start as the first pot of scalding liquid hit the men in front. The chaos that followed wasn't just physical, it was mental. Survivors would panic, trampling each other to escape, while those still standing faced the awful choice of pushing forward into certain agony or retreating into a dead end. Murder holes didn't just kill, they broke morale, turning bravery into blind terror in seconds. Some castles took this concept even further. At Warwick Castle in England, murder holes were strategically placed above the main entrance, but they also lined the passage leading to the inner keep. Attackers who breached the outer gates might think they'd won, only to find themselves herded into a second, even deadlier kill zone. The architects of these death traps understood something fundamental about human nature. Momentum is everything in battle. By staggering these horrors, they could sap an enemy's will long before they reached the heart of the fortress. The legacy of murder holes lingers in modern language for a reason. Their very existence speaks to a mindset where defense wasn't just about stopping invaders, it was about making them regret trying. Every drop of boiling oil, every arrow loosed downward, sent the same unmistakable message. In this castle, even the ceiling was your enemy. And for those who survived the onslaught, the lesson would haunt them long after the screams faded. Some weapons wound the body, others, like murder holes, scarred the mind. The drawbridge wasn't just a way across the moat, it was the ultimate test of trust. Picture this, a group of knights clad in armor, charging across what seems like solid wood, only for the entire structure to shudder and drop beneath them. The counterweights weren't just for lifting the bridge, they were loaded with hidden mechanisms, ready to turn a moment of triumph into a death plunge. With one pull of a lever, what looked like safe passage became a sheer drop into water churned with spikes or even burning oil. The genius of these traps lay in their visibility. Unlike hidden pitfalls, everyone saw the drawbridge. That was the point. Its betrayal was public, a spectacle meant to terrify. Some castles took this deception further. The planks themselves could be rigged. At Château de Pierrefonds in France, sections of the drawbridge were designed to collapse inward under precise points of weight. A vanguard might cross safely, only for the middle ranks to suddenly find themselves plunging through false flooring. Others featured retractable spikes that rose between gaps in the wood, turning a retreat into a bloodbath. And then there were the welcoming bridges left deliberately intact for attackers to seize, only for defenders to flood the moat with pitch and set it ablaze once the enemy was halfway across. The lesson was clear: in a castle, even surrender could be a trap. The psychological impact was as calculated as the engineering. A drawbridge was more than a barrier, it was a stage for dominance. Watching an entire company vanish beneath the water, their armor dragging them down as spikes did the rest, sent an unmistakable message to those still on the far bank. This wasn't just defense, it was theater, and like all good performances, the real power lay in anticipation. Would the bridge hold? Had the defenders truly fled, or were they waiting to spring the trap? The longer those questions lingered, the more hesitation spread, because the deadliest part of a rigged drawbridge wasn't the drop. It was the doubt it planted in every attacker's mind. What's chilling is how these designs blurred the line between invitation and execution. A castle's most obvious entrance became its most lethal, proving that in the medieval world, nothing, not even the ground beneath your feet, was as it seemed. The drawbridge didn't just keep enemies out, it taught them the cost of trying. Portcullises were the medieval equivalent of a guillotine suspended over every doorway, silent, heavy, and capable of transforming a bustling gateway into a butcher's block in seconds. These iron or wooden grates, studded with spikes along their lower edges, didn't just block entry, they chose victims. Picture a group of attackers surging through a castle's outer gate, their shouts of victory still hanging in the air when suddenly crash, a half-ton grid of metal plummets from the shadows above. The unlucky soul directly beneath might be bisected instantly, while those caught mid-step could find their legs pinned beneath the grate's teeth. left to bleed out as defenders rained arrows from murder holes overhead. The brutality of portcullises wasn't just in their weight, but in their precision. Unlike boiling oil or arrow volleys, which required timing and aim, a portcullis was a self-contained executioner. At Rowan Castle in the 15th century, a single drop of its portcullis turned a rebel charge into a massacre, shearing through armor like parchment and trapping dozens between the inner and outer gates, a killing box with no exit. But what made these devices truly terrifying was their unpredictability. Some were rigged to fall automatically if enemy soldiers tampered with the gate mechanisms. Others could be released remotely by a guard hidden in an overhead chamber, meaning danger might strike without a single visible defender in sight. Yet the psychological impact went deeper than the physical carnage. A raised portcullis wasn't just an open door, it was a challenge. Attackers had to weigh the risk. Was this an invitation to breach the castle, or a trap waiting to snap shut? The very act of passing beneath one required a gamble with fate, turning every entrance into a potential altar of sacrifice. And for those inside, the sight of a lowered portcullis was equally ominous. It meant the castle had sealed itself like a tomb, cutting off escape as surely as it barred entry. Some castles weaponized this duality. At Caernarfon in Wales, concentric portcullises worked in tandem. The outer one might rise to lure enemies into a courtyard, only for the inner one to drop behind them, sealing their doom. Others, like the Tower of London, featured portcullises with counterweights that could be adjusted mid-siege, allowing defenders to control the speed of the drop. A slow descent might herd invaders into a kill zone, while a sudden crash could decapitate a vanguard in front of their horrified comrades. What's often forgotten is how these devices shaped castle life even in peacetime. The creak of chains raising the portcullis each morning wasn't just routine. It was a daily reminder of the Lord's power to open or close the jaws of his domain at will. Merchants, messengers, even nobles would pause instinctively as they crossed the threshold, their necks tingling with the unspoken knowledge that above them, unseen hands still clutched the mechanisms of control. Because in a world where trust was carved from iron and wood, the true purpose of a portcullis wasn't just to defend. It was to teach every soul who passed beneath it that safety itself could be a temporary illusion. Chapels were meant to be sanctuaries, places where even the most hardened warriors could seek refuge under the eyes of God. But in the castles of medieval Europe, these sacred spaces often hid the most chilling betrayals of all. Take the chapel of St. Pierre in Château de Gizes, where the stone floor before the altar concealed a yawning pit. A visiting noble might kneel to pray, only to feel the ground give way beneath him as hidden hinges groaned open. The fall wouldn't kill him immediately, that was the point. The pit was just deep enough to break bones, leaving the victim to starve in darkness while Mass continued overhead, the hymns drowning out his cries. This wasn't just cruelty, it was sacrilege weaponized. By turning holy sites into traps, rulers sent an unmistakable message. Divine protection meant nothing against their will. At Montségur Castle, a chapel pew was rigged to collapse backward, tipping the unsuspecting occupant through a hidden chute into a cell below. Survivors, if any, would emerge days later, their ordeal framed as a miracle or divine test, twisting faith itself into a tool of control. Even the act of confession could be a trap. Some chapels featured grates in the floor of the confessional, designed to drop penitents directly into dungeons if their sins included disloyalty. The psychological toll of these violations can't be overstated. Medieval society revolved around the sanctity of churches. To violate that trust wasn't just strategic, it was a deliberate assault on the very notion of safety. Imagine sitting in a pew, listening to a priest's soothing words, while knowing the wood beneath you might be hollow, or lighting a candle at an altar, unaware that the candlestick itself could trigger a hidden mechanism. The chapel's tranquility became a mask, its serenity a lie. What's most disturbing is how these designs exploited vulnerability. People let their guard down in sacred spaces. They wept, they whispered secrets, they bowed their heads in submission. And that's exactly when the trap would spring. A lord didn't just kill his enemies in these chapels. He made them complicit in their own betrayal, luring them into a false sense of peace before revealing the truth. In his domain, even God's house answered to the throne. Archaeologists have found evidence of these traps across Europe, from loose flagstones near altars to grooves in walls suggesting retractable barriers. At Castel del Monte in Italy, a chapel's decorative labyrinth pattern on the floor may have concealed pressure plates. The message was clear: no act of devotion, no plea for mercy could shield you from the cold calculus of power. Because when even the holiest sites were rigged for treachery, nowhere and no one could ever truly be safe. In the heart of every castle, where the scent of roasting meats and fresh bread should have meant comfort, kitchens hid some of the most insidious betrayals of all. These weren't just places to prepare feasts, they were stages for silent, intimate acts of treachery. Consider the spices, those precious commodities traded across continents. A pinch too much of monkshood in the stew, a dash of hemlock slipped into the wine poisons that left no visible trace until it was far too late. Some kitchens had false-bottomed cabinets where vials of colorless toxins waited beside sacks of flour, their contents indistinguishable from ordinary seasonings. The real horror wasn't just the poisoning, it was how easily the tools of nourishment could be twisted into instruments of death. Then there were the flaws. At Pontefract Castle, the kitchen's central drain didn't just carry away dishwater, it funneled straight into the dungeons below. A clumsy servant or a cook who knew too much could slip near that grate, vanishing into darkness with a splash that no one would investigate. Other castles took this concept further, with trapdoors disguised as hearthstones or storage cellars that doubled as oubliettes. The brutality was deliberate. What better way to remind staff of their place than to turn the very room where they worked into a potential death trap? But the most chilling details were the ones that exploited trust. A lord might host a feast, publicly praising his most loyal retainer by offering the first taste of a dish, only for that servant to collapse moments later, proving the food had been safe all along. The lesson: even gratitude could be a ruse. Some kitchens featured twin pantries, one stocked with pristine ingredients for the high table, another laced with laxatives or worse for anyone deemed expendable. The message was clear: in the castle's culinary underworld, every bite carried a question. Was this meal an honor or a death sentence? Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of these kitchen horrors: a hollow mortar with traces of arsenic in its crevices, a butcher's block stained with blood that DNA tests linked to multiple unidentified individuals. At Château de Cessigno in Brittany, a bread oven concealed a side compartment large enough to hide a body, its ashes mingled with fragments of bone. These weren't accidents or afterthoughts. They were proof that in the medieval world, the line between nourishment and nightmare was as thin as a knife's edge. What's unsettling is how ordinary these spaces seemed. A pot bubbling over a fire, a scullery made scrubbing pots, the veneer of domesticity masked a far darker reality. Because in castles built on betrayal, even the act of breaking bread could be a lethal gamble. And for those who worked there, the greatest terror wasn't the poison in the pantry. It was never knowing if today's meal would be their last. The Great Hall was the crown jewel of any medieval castle, a soaring space where kings held court, alliances were forged, and feasts could last for days. But behind the glittering tapestries and roaring fireplaces, these halls were engineered for deception. At Raglan Castle in Wales, the Lord's High Table sat atop a raised dais with a hidden compartment beneath. Should trouble erupt during a banquet, a discreet lever could collapse the entire platform, sending the ruler sliding down a chute to safety while armed guards poured in from side passages. What looked like a simple stage was actually an escape route disguised as a seat of power. Chandeliers served a dual purpose in these halls. While they illuminated celebrations by day, their heavy iron frames could be rigged to drop on command at night. Historical accounts from Berg Eltz in Germany describe counterweight systems that allowed defenders to send a half-ton chandelier crashing onto intruders, turning a symbol of warmth into a weapon of blunt force trauma. Even the placement of these fixtures was strategic, hung directly above the spots where visiting nobles would gather, ensuring maximum impact if treachery was suspected. But the most insidious tricks played on the mind. Some halls featured whispering galleries, carefully curved walls that carried voices to hidden alcoves where spies listened. A lord might toast a guest's health at one end of the table while his steward eavesdropped on private conversations 30 feet away. At Château de Sommer in France, the throne itself was a masterpiece of misdirection. Its gilded back concealed a pivoting mechanism that could rotate the entire chair into a secret corridor, leaving bewildered guests staring at an empty seat. The effect was theatrical. One moment the king held court, the next he'd vanished like a ghost. What made these deceptions so effective was their timing. Great halls were stages for pageantry, where emotions ran high and wine flowed freely. A misplaced word during a toast might be punished by a sudden draft extinguishing the candles, the signal for archers hidden in the minstrel's gallery to loose their arrows. A guest who overstayed their welcome could find their chair rigged to tip backward into a waiting pit. Even the rushes strewn across the floor sometimes concealed pressure plates that triggered hidden spikes or alarms. The genius of these designs lay in their plausibility. A collapsing floor could be dismissed as rotten timber. A dropped chandelier might pass as faulty chains. But for those who knew the truth, every feast was a performance with two scripts, one for honored guests, another for those who'd outlived their usefulness. Because in the great halls of power, the greatest threat wasn't the enemy at your gates. It was the friend beside you at the table, and the castle's willingness to help them betray you. Beneath the dappled sunlight and sweet perfume of roses, castle gardens hid treachery as carefully cultivated as the rarest blooms. These weren't just retreats for relaxation. They were psychological battlegrounds where every hedge and fountain could turn lethal. Take the labyrinth at Hampton Court Palace, its winding paths designed to disorient. What seemed like a playful challenge concealed something far darker, dead ends that opened into spike-lined pits when triggered by hidden counterweights. A nobleman chasing a lover through the hedges might vanish without a sound, his disappearance blamed on a midnight duel or drunken misstep. Even water features became weapons. The innocent-looking fountain at Château de Villandry sprayed scalding jets when a concealed boiler was lit, turning a refreshing splash into a scalding nightmare for anyone who lingered too close. Other gardens used gravity-fed pipes to flood entire sections on command, drowning intruders in shallow ornamental ponds that moments earlier had reflected clouds. The cruelty was theatrical, a demonstration that even nature answered to the castle's lord. But the true genius lay in the garden's dual purpose. A bower of fragrant herbs might conceal a trapdoor leading to the dungeons, its wooden bench swinging open at the touch of a hidden lever. Topiaries sculpted into playful shapes could hide archers' niches, their leafy branches parting just enough for a crossbow bolt to find its mark. Even the act of tending these spaces was a risk. Gardeners knew too much, so their shears were sometimes deliberately blunted, ensuring any accidental stab wounds came from frustrated hands rather than rebellious ones. What's chilling is how these designs exploited human instinct. We let our guard down in beautiful places, we stroll, we daydream, we whisper secrets, and that's precisely when the garden struck. A duke might lead a rival down a secluded path to admire the peonies, only for his guest to step on a pressure plate that released a swinging log from the trees. Or consider the rose arbors at Warwick Castle, their thorny arches perfect for concealing razor wire garrotes at neck height. These weren't just traps. They were performances teaching the same brutal lesson. In a world where even petals could mask daggers, trust was the rarest bloom of all. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of these horticultural horrors, disguised irrigation channels that doubled as drowning pools, statue plinths with hollow compartments for poison darts. At the Alhambra in Spain, a delicate latticework pavilion's floor tiles were engineered to tilt when wet, sending careless strollers sliding into a cistern below. The message was clear: paradise was an illusion, and in the gardens of power, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy was the belief that anywhere, even among flowers, could ever be safe. Master builders like James of St. George walked a razor's edge, their genius celebrated, their lives disposable. Hired to craft fortresses that defied betrayal, they became the first victims of the very secrets they engineered. Sworn to silence under pain of death, these architects designed labyrinths of deception, knowing they might never leave them alive. Take the fate of the unknown craftsmen behind Chateau Gaylord's collapsing staircases. After rigging the steps to give way beneath attackers, records suggest they were quietly strangled and buried within the castle walls, their bodies becoming part of the foundation. The irony was as thick as the mortar they mixed. The men who made traps irresistible were often the first to disappear into them. Blueprints weren't just documents, they were death warrants. To prevent knowledge of a castle's hidden passages from leaking, rulers ordered every sketch burned once construction ended. Some architects, like those working on the tower of London's infamous Bloody Tower, were forced to work in isolated sections, each team unaware of the other's designs. Only the king and his most trusted steward held the complete mental map, turning architectural mastery into a fragmented puzzle no single mind could reconstruct. This paranoia birthed chilling innovations. At Mont Saint Michel, masons reportedly carved critical mechanisms in code, their symbols meaningless without oral explanations that died with them. Yet the greatest betrayal wasn't the secrecy, it was the illusion of reward. Master builders were lavished with titles and gold during construction, only to be accused of plotting the moment their work was done. James of St. George himself narrowly escaped this fate when Edward I, fearing his knowledge of Welsh castle weaknesses, abruptly cancelled his pension. Lesser architects met worse ends. A Venetian designer at Spilberg Castle was famously walled up inside a chamber he'd just finished, his skeleton discovered centuries later still clutching his tools. This paradox reveals the dark heart of medieval power. Architects were simultaneously revered and reviled, their skills essential, their survival optional. Every trapdoor they engineered mirrored their own precarious existence, one day designing a king's stronghold, the next vanishing through its flaws. Their legacy lives on in the blank spaces of history, their names erased but their deadly ingenuity cemented in stone. Because in a world where even the walls had ears, the men who built them couldn't be allowed to speak. The Spymaster held the castle's darkest truths in his palm, like a coiled serpent knowledge that could protect a kingdom or unravel it in a single whispered confession. While lords and ladies danced through candlelit halls, oblivious to the mechanisms hidden beneath their feet, this shadowy figure moved through passages no one else could see. A misplaced word from his lips could turn murder holes into harmless decoration, render trapdoors inert, or worse, hand those very weapons to an enemy. That's why the Spymaster's loyalty came at a brutal price. At Chinon Castle, records describe a vault where these men were periodically locked overnight with nothing but a dagger and a cup of wine. The message was unmistakable. Betrayal would be met with swift silence, whether by their own hand or another's. Centralizing this knowledge wasn't just about efficiency, it was about survival. In the 12th century, King Henry II's Spymaster, a shadowy figure known only as the Keeper, maintained a cipher so complex that even the king himself only learned portions of the castle's secrets as needed. The reasoning was coldly logical. A ruler captured in battle couldn't reveal what he didn't fully know, but this system had a fatal flaw. When the Keeper vanished during a rebellion in 1183, entire sections of Winchester Castle became death traps for the king's own men. Staircases collapsed under loyal knights, and Portcullis's crushed allies rushing to defend the throne. The very defenses meant to safeguard the kingdom now turned against it, all because one man's knowledge had been extinguished too soon. Some rulers attempted safeguards. The Duke of Burgundy's infamous Book of Stone contained coded diagrams of every trap in his castles, but its pages were written in disappearing ink that faded within hours of exposure to light. Others relied on gruesome mnemonics. A spymaster for the Hungarian crown was said to have memorized trap locations by associating each with a specific mutilation inflicted on prisoners in the dungeon below. Yet these measures couldn't erase the fundamental paradox. The more perfect a spymaster's knowledge, the greater the catastrophe if he switched sides. In 1429, the fall of Rouen Castle was hastened by its own spymaster, who not only revealed hidden passages to besiegers but demonstrated how to flood the escape tunnels with burning pitch. The human cost of this secrecy was staggering. Spymasters lived like ghosts, their identities erased from official records, their families often held hostage in comfortable but closely watched estates. At Kenilworth Castle, archaeologists uncovered a small chamber adjoining the Spymaster's quarters, not for his use, but for the scribe who documented his every movement. Even their deaths were orchestrated illusions. When Edward IV's Spymaster fell ill, his funeral featured an empty coffin while the real man was sealed inside a fortified tower with enough supplies to last a decade. Whether this was protection or imprisonment depended on who you asked. What's haunting is how these systems mirrored the castles they protected, outwardly impregnable, yet brittle at their core. A single defection could collapse an entire network of defenses, like a keystone pulled from an arch, and that vulnerability shaped history itself. When Richard III's Spymaster allegedly switched allegiances before Bosworth Field, it wasn't just secrets that were lost, it was a kingdom. Because in the end, the deadliest trapdoor wasn't made of wood or iron. It was the human heart, always one beat away from betrayal. While kings and spymasters plotted in their towers, another group wielded quiet influence over the castle's deadly machinery, the noblewomen who ruled the household. A duchess arranging flowers in her solar might know which floorboard concealed a listening tube to the chapel below. A queen dismissing her maids could casually adjust a tapestry, triggering a hidden door to her husband's war council. These women weren't just decorative figures in the castle's grand drama. They were its silent stage managers, turning domesticity into a weapon. Take Elena of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most formidable queens. While history remembers her battles and rebellions, few consider how she weaponized the very architecture around her. During her imprisonment at Salisbury Castle, guards reported strange occurrences, food appearing in her tower despite locked doors, messages slipping past sentries. Years later, renovations revealed a narrow stairwell hidden behind a false hearth, its entrance worn smooth from use. Elena hadn't just endured captivity. She'd mastered it, using the castle's own secrets against her jailers. The household staff knew better than anyone where the real power lay. Laundresses could identify which nobles' shirts bore sweat stains from nervous midnight meetings. Cooks noticed when certain dishes were requested for guests who never left, and the noble women who supervised them, they heard every whispered confession, every drunken slip of the tongue. At Conway Castle, records show the Countess kept a ledger of which servants polished which hidden mechanisms, a roster of vulnerability that became her private arsenal. One wrong word from a disloyal knight, and suddenly his favorite squire might be assigned to clean the murder holes above the gatehouse during a rainstorm. Some women took this knowledge further. Isabella of France, wife to Edward II, allegedly used her familiarity with Leeds Castle's water systems to stage a coup. By ordering servants to block certain drainage channels during a feast, she flooded the lower halls, forcing her husband's supporters into cramped upper chambers where her archers picked them off. The official chronicles called it divine punishment. Those who knew the truth understood. A woman who controlled the household accounts could also control where the bodies were buried. What made these noblewomen so dangerous wasn't just their access to secrets, it was how society underestimated them. While lords obsessed over fortifications against armies, their wives studied the vulnerabilities within. A lady's maid might casually straighten a bed curtain, her fingers brushing a lever that unlocked a spy hole into the armory. A daughter practicing embroidery could trace the castle's hidden corridors in her stitching, her innocent hobby masking a perfect mental map of every trapdoor. The greatest power often lay in restraint. Unlike men who flaunted their control through public executions, noble women practiced a subtler tyranny. A queen might spare a traitor's life while ensuring his wine always came from the cask stored nearest the garderobe chute. A baroness could pardon a thief, then assign him to clean the oubliette's grate until the nightmares broke his mind. Their weapons weren't swords or siege engines, but the quiet certainty that every servant's loyalty, every child's bedtime story, every whispered prayer contained the potential for betrayal. In the end, these women proved that castles weren't just fortresses, they were living, breathing entities that answered not to whoever shouted loudest, but to those who listened closest. And in a world where stone could lie and flaws could vanish, sometimes the most lethal trap of all was a noblewoman's smile as she poured your wine. The thunder of cannon fire changed everything. By the 16th century, the once impenetrable walls of medieval castles crumbled under sustained artillery barrages, and with them faded the age of architectural deception. Why waste resources building elaborate trapdoors when a single well-placed cannonball could reduce your masterpiece of treachery to rubble? The Renaissance ushered in a new philosophy of power, one where rulers preferred to dazzle rather than intimidate, to display their wealth openly instead of hiding behind layers of stone and suspicion. Palaces like Versailles or the Pitti Palace in Florence embodied this shift. Their grand staircases led upward to light-filled galleries, not downward to oubliettes. Hallways stretched long and straight, offering clear sight lines rather than dead-end death traps. Even the gardens followed geometric precision, a far cry from the murderous mazes of medieval strongholds. But don't mistake this openness for naivety. The politics of the Renaissance court were every bit as lethal. They just traded spikes and secret passages for poisoned pens and whispered alliances. A noble might no longer fear a collapsing floor, but a doctored letter or a tainted snuff box could prove just as fatal. Yet remnants of the old ways lingered. Beneath the gilded ceilings of Fontainebleau, Historians uncovered a hidden corridor connecting the king's bedchamber to an outer courtyard, proof that even in an age of enlightenment, some habits died hard. And while moats became ornamental water features, their bridges were still designed to be raised at a moment's notice. The tools of betrayal had simply evolved. Where a medieval lord might drop a rival through a trapdoor, a Renaissance prince would bribe his servants to lace his wine. The methods changed, but the game remained the same. What's fascinating is how architecture reflected this transition. The same rulers who commissioned soaring, light-filled ballrooms also built discreet, back staircases for urgent midnight meetings. Ornate frescoes hid peepholes, and sumptuous tapestries muffled the sound of approaching assassins. Even the famed Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with its breathtaking reflections, served a dual purpose. No conspirator could whisper without risking their words bouncing straight to the king's ears. The decline of deceptive design wasn't about abandoning treachery, it was about refining it. In a world where power relied increasingly on perception, the most effective traps were the ones no one saw coming. Because whether in a candlelit dungeon or a sunlit salon, the real danger was never the room itself, it was the people in it. Walk into any high-security corporate headquarters today, and you'll unknowingly pass through the modern descendants of medieval trapdoors, glass doors that lock remotely, elevators that only respond to keycard access, even ventilation systems that can be flooded with sleeping gas in an emergency. The technology has evolved, but the philosophy remains unchanged. Control the space, and you control the people within it. Take the panic rooms hidden behind false walls in luxury penthouses, direct heirs to the secret passages of medieval castles. Where a lord might have slipped behind a tapestry to evade assassins, today's billionaires vanish into reinforced safe rooms at the touch of a button. The materials are sleeker, but the intent is identical: survival through deception. Government buildings take this further. Ever notice how certain corridors in capital complexes seem to wind unnecessarily? That's not poor design. It's a psychological holdover from castle kill zones, forcing visitors into controlled pathways where every step can be monitored. Modern surveillance cameras are just digital murder holes, their lenses peering down from ceilings the way archers once did. Even the White House's famed tunnel system echoes medieval escape routes, allowing presidents to move unseen while the public imagines them safely in the Oval Office. The difference: today's rulers don't need spike pits when they have biometric scanners that can lock out entire wings with a fingerprint. Corporate boardrooms reveal even subtler tricks. That imposing, oversized table isn't just for show. It's a power play straight from the great halls of feudal lords. The CEO sits at the head, flanked by allies, while dissenters are strategically placed near sound-muffling panels that distort their voices. Some tech campuses take inspiration from medieval gardens, using open layouts to encourage transparency, while hiding server rooms behind unmarked doors with retinal scanners. The message is the same as it was 800 years ago: you're only allowed to see what we want you to see. Perhaps the most telling modern parallel is in data centers, the castles of our digital age. Their unmarked exteriors conceal labyrinthine interiors, with man-trap airlocks that conceal intruders between bulletproof doors. Server racks line corridors like suits of armor, while AI-driven surveillance replaces the Spymaster's network of whispers. Even the cooling systems have a medieval brutality. Step too close to certain areas, and liquid nitrogen vents will flash freeze you where you stand. The architects of these facilities study historical castles not for aesthetics, but for lessons in controlled access and psychological deterrence. What's fascinating is how these designs shape behavior without us realizing. Just as medieval subjects avoided certain hallways for fear of trapdoors, today's employees instinctively steer clear of restricted floors. The glow of a security camera triggers the same primal caution as the shadow of a murder hole once did. Because while we've swapped stone for steel and torches for touchscreens, the core truth remains: architecture doesn't just shelter power, it enforces it. And the real legacy of medieval betrayal isn't the traps themselves, but the understanding that any space, no matter how beautiful, can be weaponized against those who walk its halls. Ground-penetrating radar pulses through ancient stone like X-ray vision, revealing horrors medieval builders thought they'd buried forever. At Newark Castle, what appeared to be solid foundation walls concealed a spiderweb of tunnels, some leading to dead ends, others dropping abruptly into vertical shafts lined with jagged stone teeth. These weren't escape routes, they were digestive tracts designed to lure invaders deep into the castle's belly before the architecture itself turned predator. Laser scanning tells an even darker story. When researchers mapped Château de Falaise in Normandy, lasers exposed grooves in the Great Hall's floor-precise channels that once guided blood toward hidden drains. The patterns matched contemporary accounts of a dancing floor that could tilt victims toward strategically placed blade slots in the walls. What visitors assumed was uneven settling was actually a choreographed death trap, its mechanism lost until light beams uncovered the truth 8 centuries later. Thermal imaging cracks opened secrets even ruins refused to surrender. The crumbled remains of Dunstanburgh Castle showed cold spots beneath what's left of the chapel, not ghosts, but hollow chambers where temperatures remain unnaturally stable. Further excavation revealed an oubliette disguised as a crypt, its entrance cleverly aligned with a stained glass window's shadow, so the trapdoor only became visible at midday. This wasn't just engineering, it was solar-powered psychological torture. The most chilling revelations come from 3D reconstructions. Digital models of Corfe castles show how its famous murder holes were actually part of a larger deception. The gaps in the ceiling weren't just for dropping projectiles, they funneled screams upward into the Lord's chambers, turning agonized cries into a perverse form of entertainment. Archaeologists found animal bones mixed with gaming dice in the adjacent room, suggesting bets were placed on how long victims would last below. Every scan rewrites history. What we once dismissed as myth-collapsing staircases, whispering walls, floors that drank blood now stand confirmed by hard data. The stones themselves are confessing, and their testimony paints a picture far more calculating than any chronicle dared record. Because the greatest trick these castles ever pulled wasn't hiding their traps, it was convincing us they were just stories. Shakespeare's Macbeth doesn't just tell a story of ambition, it stages its climax in a castle literally designed for betrayal. When Macduff's army marches on Dunsinane, they carry branches from Burnham Wood, camouflaging their numbers, but the real deception lies inside the walls. Shakespeare's audience would have known the unspoken horror. Castles like Dunsinane weren't just backdrops for drama, their very architecture conspired with tyrants. Those towering stone walls Macbeth boasts about, they likely concealed murder holes for dropping boiling oil on guests, the safe chambers where he plots Duncan's murder. Probably rigged with listening tubes so loyalists could overhear traitors. The play never shows these mechanisms, but their specter lingers in every whispered conspiracy, every sudden act of violence. Because in the medieval mind, a castle wasn't just a setting, it was an active participant in treachery. Jump forward 4 centuries, and Game of Thrones' Red Keep takes this dread to new extremes. The show's infamous Purple Wedding plays out in a courtyard that seems open and secure until a hidden poison vial proves nowhere is safe. Later, When Circe destroys the Great Sept with wildfire, it echoes the real-life use of concealed explosives in medieval sieges. But the most chilling detail is the Red Keep's labyrinth of tunnels. These aren't just plot devices, they're straight from history. Like the real-life escape routes under Warwick Castle, they serve dual purposes: salvation for the powerful, death traps for the unwary. When Arya flees through them, pursued by guards who know the passages better, the scene taps into an ancient fear that the walls themselves might turn against you. What's fascinating is how these fictional betrayals borrow from actual engineering. The collapsing staircase in The Princess Bride mirrors Shate Gaillard's collapsible steps. The shifting rooms in Hogwarts recall the trick corridors of Montsegur Castle. Even Disney's Sleeping Beauty got one thing right. Maleficent's dungeon, with its sudden pit of thorns, isn't far off from the spike-lined oubliettes of Loches. These stories persist because they're rooted in truth. The trapdoor isn't just a plot twist, it's a historical echo, reminding us that the greatest threats often come from below. Modern horror films have weaponized this legacy. The Conjuring's haunted houses inherit castle logic, creaking floorboards that signal unseen dangers, basements that swallow the curious, doors that lock from the outside. Even non-historical settings use medieval tricks. The shifting halls of the Shining's Overlook Hotel. That's pure castle psychology, the terror of space itself becoming untrustworthy. And when Get Out's protagonist discovers photographs in the attic, it's a twist worthy of any Spymaster's listening gallery, proof that the house wasn't just watching him but collecting trophies. Why does this trope endure? Because it taps into a primal unease, the fear that our shelters might betray us. From Dracula's hidden passages to Parasite's deceptive basement, stories keep resurrecting castle logic because the danger feels intimate. A battlefield is honest in its violence, but a home, that's where we're supposed to lower our guard. When fiction makes walls complicit in treachery, it violates our deepest sense of safety. And that's why, centuries after the last oubliette was sealed, we still flinch at the creak of a floorboard in the dark. The castles may be ruins, but their lessons live on. Trust the knife at your throat more than the floor beneath your feet. The debate over castle traps cuts to the heart of medieval morality. Were these ingenious deceptions acts of self-preservation or instruments of unchecked tyranny? Defenders argue these designs emerged from an era where survival demanded brutal pragmatism. A besieged lord facing rebellion had few options. Elaborate traps could deter attackers with minimal bloodshed, potentially saving lives on both sides. The murder holes at Carcassonne, for example, allowed defenders to pick off invaders without open combat, sparing their own soldiers from pitched battles. Even the infamous oubliettes served a grim logic. Disappearing troublemakers quietly prevented public executions that might spark further unrest. In a world where power balanced on a knife's edge, architectural deception wasn't just strategy, it was statecraft. Yet critics counter that these mechanisms often targeted the wrong people. Historical records from Rouen reveal how Portcullis crushed peasant rioters protesting grain shortages, not foreign armies. The spiked pits at Chinon were allegedly used more often against rival nobles than invading forces, turning castle defenses into tools of political purge. And what of the servants who accidentally triggered hidden traps? At Pontefract Castle, archaeologists found skeletons in kitchen chutes, likely scullery maids who stumbled upon mechanisms meant for others. The cruelty wasn't collateral damage, it was the point. These designs didn't just protect, they terrorized, enforcing obedience through the constant threat of vanishing without trial or trace. Modern parallels deepen the dilemma. Today's governments face similar questions. Is mass surveillance a necessary shield against threats, or an overreach that erodes liberty. Medieval lords argued their traps preserved order. Contemporary leaders justify data collection as cybersecurity. Both rely on the same unsettling premise. Safety requires surrendering the right to privacy, to certainty, even to trust. The castle's whispering galleries find their echo in smartphone microphones that listen for keywords, just as spike pits morph into algorithmic blacklists that ruin lives without explanation. History's verdict on medieval traps remains split, but their legacy is undeniable once you accept that deception is the price of security. Where do you draw the line? Perhaps the most troubling revelation lies in who benefited. While castle traps were justified as communal safeguards, they overwhelmingly served individual rulers. The secret passages at Windsor didn't protect the populace. They let monarchs flee rebellions while subjects bore the brunt of reprisals. Contrast this with truly communal defenses, like the shared cisterns of Carcassonne that ensured water for all during sieges. The difference is telling. One design fostered collective survival, the other prioritized elite survival at any cost. That distinction still haunts security debates today, from gated communities to encrypted messaging. Who gets protected and who becomes expendable often depends on who holds the keys or the blueprints. Archaeologists uncover another layer to this moral puzzle. At some sites, traps were added generations after construction, coinciding with periods of paranoid rule. The dancing Flaw at Falaise was installed during Duke Robert's reign, a time when chroniclers describe escalating purges. Other castles show traps deliberately disabled during more stable eras, their mechanisms rusted shut. This suggests these weren't immutable necessities, but choices, weapons of fear deployed when rulers felt insecure. The stones themselves confess that architectural betrayal wasn't about defense. It was about control, wielded most fiercely by those who trusted their people least. Yet before we judge too harshly, consider the alternatives. In an age without due process, where rebellion meant slaughter and rivals poisoned wine cups, perhaps traps were the lesser evil. A collapsing staircase might seem barbaric until compared to the mass burnings ordered by Vlad the Impaler or the public disembowelments under Henry VIII. At least traps offered quick deaths, even if their randomness was psychologically brutal. This uncomfortable relativity forces us to ask, are we appalled by medieval traps because they're uniquely cruel, or because they make explicit the hidden violence underlying all power structures? The debate refuses neat resolution. For every scholar who sees castle traps as early war crimes, another cites their deterrent value in preventing larger conflicts. What's undeniable is their lasting shadow, not just in modern security, but in our collective imagination. When we tense up passing through airport scanners or wonder who might access our webcam, we're reliving the same primal unease that medieval subjects felt stepping onto a suspicious floorboard. The real ethical question isn't whether those traps were justified then. It's why, centuries later, we've built a world that still makes us ask whether trapdoors are hidden. Walking through the ruins of a medieval castle today, it's easy to forget these stones were once instruments of fear. The oubliettes are now roped off for safety, the murder holes fitted with explanatory plaques, and the collapsing staircases stabilized for visitors. Yet something primal stirs when you peer into a pit that once swallowed people whole, or run your fingers along grooves in the floor where blood once drained. These sites have been sanitized for tourism, but they haven't lost their power to unsettle. Take the Tower of London's infamous Bloody Tower. Tourists snap selfies where prisoners once scratched their final prayers into the walls, the scratches now polished smooth by centuries of curious hands. Guides cheerfully recount tales of disappearing nobles while standing on the exact spot where a trapdoor might have dropped them into darkness. The dissonance is jarring. What was once a place of terror is now a backdrop for family vacation photos. Yet when the crowd thins and you're alone in the stairwell, the weight of history presses down. That creak underfoot isn't just old wood, it's the echo of someone else's last step. Some castles lean into the macabre. Warwick Castle's horrible histories exhibit lets children crank a model Portcullis to squash toy knights, turning medieval brutality into playful learning. At Château de Loches, visitors can descend into the oubliette where Cardinal Balou was imprisoned for 11 years, now lit with respectful spotlights and a tasteful bench for reflection. These compromises walk a fine line between education and exploitation. Does simulating a trapdoor's drop with sound effects honor the past or trivialize it? The answer depends on whether you're the one hearing the thud from a safe distance or imagining it from the pit's perspective. Yet even the most commercialized sites can't fully neuter their darkness. At Edinburgh Castle's underground vaults, temperature drops noticeably when you enter the cell where prisoners were left to freeze. The walls still bear their original markings, not just tallies counting days, but frantic sketches of gallows and angels. No amount of gift shops or audio tours can erase the visceral chill of standing where someone realized they'd never see sunlight again. These spaces resist tidy narratives, forcing us to grapple with the fact that history's grandeur was built on cruelty. What's revealing is how differently cultures memorialize these traps. German castles like Burg Eltz present them as engineering marvels, focusing on the craftsmanship of hidden levers and counterweights. French chateaux often frame them as political tools, with exhibits linking specific traps to royal power struggles. In contrast, British heritage sites frequently emphasize the human cost, displaying shackles and personal effects found in excavations. These approaches aren't just academic, they shape how we process the morality of architectural betrayal. Is a murder hole a clever defense or a war crime frozen in stone? The answer changes depending on which side of the channel you're standing. Perhaps the most profound moments come unexpectedly, in the quiet corner of a lesser-known castle like Spilberg in the Czech Republic, where restoration hasn't erased the desperation etched into the walls. Here, away from crowds and merchandise, the past feels less like a lesson and more like a whisper. When your shadow falls across an ancient spike pit now filled with coins tossed by superstitious tourists, the irony stings. We've turned instruments of control into wishing wells, as if a euro could ever balance the scales of suffering. These castles challenge us to hold two truths at once, that their beauty is undeniable and their brutality unforgivable. They remind us that history isn't a museum, it's a mirror. The same instincts that built trapdoors now sell tickets to see them. The thirst for power that dug oubliettes now fuels our fascination with them. And when we lean over a railing to stare into the darkness below, we're not just observers of the past, we're participants in its endless echo. Experimental archaeologists don't just study history, they step into its shadows, pulling medieval nightmares back into the light. At Gaidelin Castle in France, where builders construct an authentic 13th century fortress using only period techniques, researchers tested a recreated Portcullis. The result was chilling. When released, the iron grate weighing over half a ton took less than 2 seconds to slam shut, its spiked lower edge embedding 6 inches into the oak threshold. That's faster than a modern elevator's emergency brake and far deadlier. The team used ballistic gel dummies to simulate human targets afterward. The bodies were cleanly severed at the torso, proving historical accounts of bisected invaders weren't exaggeration. They were understatements, but the real revelation wasn't the violence, it was the precision. Reconstructing Warwick Castle's murder holes required painstaking calculations, the angles of the openings, the viscosity of heated oil, even the acoustics of the passage below. Too steep an angle and the oil would splash back onto defenders. Too shallow and it would drip rather than pour. The final design allowed a single archer to hit 5 targets in a row with arrows, while a cauldron of oil took exactly 9 seconds to empty through the hole, creating an inescapable slick of boiling death. These weren't crude weapons, they were engineered systems as calculated as a Swiss watch and twice as ruthless. Some experiments uncovered darker subtleties. A team at Caerphilly Castle rebuilt a collapsing staircase only to discover its steps didn't just drop. They pivoted unevenly, ensuring victims tumbled sideways into a specific corner where archers had the clearest shot. Their accidental stumble was choreographed. Even the sound played a role. The hollow space beneath amplified creaks when someone stepped on the rigged boards, giving defenders a half-second warning. Every element, from the wood's grain to the rust on the hinges, was optimized for betrayal. Perhaps the most unsettling finding came from Obliet recreations. Modern volunteers who spent just 30 minutes in a reconstructed pit reported hallucinations from oxygen deprivation, while period accounts suggest some victims survived weeks. The difference: medieval builders understood airflow intuitively. At Loch's castle, archaeologists found that the oubliette's neck narrowed slightly toward the top, creating a convection current that brought in just enough air to prolong suffering without allowing clear-headed resistance. This wasn't just sadism, it was applied physics, honed through gruesome trial and error. What these experiments prove is that medieval traps weren't improvised brutalities. They were the product of generations of quiet observation and refinement. A lord didn't just want his enemies dead, he wanted their deaths to serve as lessons, written in geometry and gravity. And when you see a reconstructed spike pit swallow a test dummy hole, or hear the sickening crunch of a portcullis hitting its stop, you're not just witnessing history. You're standing at the intersection of artistry and atrocity, where every splinter of wood and chip of stone was shaped by the most powerful motivator of all, the will to survive no matter the